Leonardo da Vinci, the man who dreamed the future. Imagine this. It's the middle of the night, somewhere in Italy. The year is around 1490. A single candle flickers on a wooden desk, and hunched over that desk, scribbling furiously by candlelight, is a man who has not slept in 2 days. His hands are stained with ink. No, wait, also paint, and something reddish-brown that might be clay, and possibly a little bit of whatever he was dissecting in the room next door. Yeah, dissecting. On the desk in front of him are dozens of loose pages, covered in the tiniest, most cramped handwriting you've ever seen. But here's the thing. If you tried to read those pages, you couldn't, because this man writes backwards. Every single word, written from right to left, like a mirror image. On one page, a sketch of human bones so detailed it looks like a medical textbook. On the next, a design for a flying machine drawn 500 years before the airplane was invented. On the next, a painting study of a woman's smile, so haunting, so mysterious, that people are still arguing about what it means today. Who is this man? His name is Leonardo da Vinci, and he might just be the most extraordinary human being who ever lived. Welcome back, history explorers. Today we are diving deep, and I mean really deep, into the life of one of the most fascinating, most mind-blowing, most impossibly talented people in all of human history, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, you might have heard that name before. Maybe you've seen a picture of the Mona Lisa. You know, that small painting of a woman with a mysterious smile that lives behind bulletproof glass in a museum in Paris and has its own bodyguards. Yep, bodyguards. For a painting. Or maybe you've seen his famous drawing called the Vitruvian Man, the one with a man standing inside a circle and a square at the same time, arms and legs stretched out like a human compass. But here's the thing. Those two images are just the tiniest peek at who Leonardo actually was. Because Leonardo wasn't just a painter. He was a sculptor, an architect, a musician, an engineer, a scientist, a mathematician, a geologist, a botanist, an anatomist, someone who studies the human body, an inventor, a writer, a philosopher, and a chef who apparently invented a really complicated version of table napkins. We are not joking about the napkins. We'll get there. The point is, Leonardo da Vinci was not a normal person. He was a person who looked at the entire world, every river, every bird, every shadow, every beating heart, and asked, why? And then he wrote it all down in those backwards notebooks of his. Over 5,000 pages of notes and drawings that survive to this day, out of an estimated tens of thousands of pages he may have written in his lifetime. Today, we are going to travel back over 500 years to a small hilltop town in Italy, and we are going to follow Leonardo's life from the very beginning all the way to the very end. By the time we're done, I think you'll agree, there has never been anyone quite like him. Let's go. Chapter 1. The Boy from Vinci, Birth and Early Childhood. To understand Leonardo, we have to start with a little geography. Picture the country of Italy. Now picture the northern part of Italy, in a region called Tuscany, a place famous even today for its rolling green hills, its vineyards crawling with grapevines, its silver-green olive trees, and its warm golden light that makes everything look like it belongs in a painting. Got it? Good. Now zoom in on that landscape. Find a small hill town called Vinci. It's so small it barely shows up on most maps. The streets are narrow and wind uphill in a tangle. The buildings are made of stone that's been there for centuries. There's a river nearby, the Arno, that snakes through the valley below. And in a farmhouse in or near this little town, historians still debate the exact location, but it was in the territory of Vinci. On the 15th of April, in the year 1452, a baby boy was born. His name was Leonardo. Now here's where it gets complicated right away, because Leonardo's family situation was unusual, even for the 15th century. His father was a man named Ser Piero da Vinci. Ser was a title, like Mr., but fancier. It meant Piero was a notary. A notary was kind of like a lawyer mixed with a document specialist. His job was to make contracts and agreements official. It was a respectable, important job. His mother was a young woman named Caterina. She was not married to Piero. She was likely a peasant woman, someone of simple, working-class origins. And because she and Piero were not married, Leonardo was what people at the time called an illegitimate child. That's a term that meant your parents weren't married when you were born. In the 15th century, this was a big deal. It affected your rights, your social status, and your opportunities in life. We'll see how this shaped Leonardo's path in surprising ways. Very soon after Leonardo was born, his parents went their separate ways. Caterina married a local man. Piero also married a woman named Albiera degli Amadori from a respectable Florentine family. And Leonardo went to live with his father and his paternal grandfather, that's his dad's dad, a man named Antonio, on the family property near Vinci. So baby Leonardo grew up in a home with his father, his grandparents, and his uncle, a young man named Francesco, who was only about 15 years older than Leonardo himself. Francesco would become one of Leonardo's favorite companions growing up, almost like an older brother. Fun fact, Leonardo's full name wasn't Leonardo da Vinci, the way we think of last names today. Da Vinci simply means from Vinci, from the town of Vinci, so his name essentially translates to Leonardo from Vinci. He didn't have a last name the way you do. In Italy at that time, people were often just identified by where they came from. Now, what was Leonardo's childhood actually like? Well, we don't have a diary from his childhood. We can't know every single thing he did. But we can piece together a picture from historical records, from what Leonardo himself wrote in his notebooks as an adult, and from the world around him. And here's what we know. Leonardo grew up in the countryside, rolling hills, animals, streams, fields, the kind of place where a curious kid could wander for hours. And Leonardo, it seems, was desperately curious. From what he later wrote and drew, we can tell that he spent enormous amounts of time outside, watching how water flows in a stream, watching how birds move their wings, watching how light changed the colors on a hillside at different hours of the day, watching how plants grew, how insects moved, how clouds formed. He wasn't just looking, he was studying. Even as a small boy, Leonardo seems to have had this intense, almost hungry need to understand how things worked. Fun fact, Leonardo left us a memory of one of his earliest moments of curiosity. In one of his notebooks, he wrote about what he believed was his very first memory. As a baby lying in his cradle, a bird, a kite, which is a type of hawk, came and opened the baby's mouth with its tail feathers, striking against his lips. Whether this was a real memory or a dream, we can't know for sure. But it's fascinating that even his earliest recorded memory involved a bird in flight, and as we'll see, Leonardo spent his whole life dreaming about flying. There is also a story, possibly legendary but wonderfully fitting, that one day a local farmer asked Piero da Vinci to bring a decorative shield to Florence to be painted. Piero asked young Leonardo to make something for it. Leonardo thought about it carefully, and then painted a terrifying monster on the shield, assembled from pieces of different real animals. Lizards, bats, snakes, locusts, all combined into one nightmarish creature. When his father saw it, he jumped back in shock. The painting was so realistic, so horrifying, so vivid, it nearly scared him out of his skin. Piero, being a smart businessman, immediately sold the shield to a dealer for a high price and bought his farmer friend a cheaper replacement. He recognized that his son had something extraordinary. Leonardo da Vinci was not a normal child, and he was about to enter a world that would give that extraordinary talent somewhere to grow. But where exactly would that be, and what would it cost him to get there? Keep watching. Chapter 2. A New City, a New World, Florence in the 1460s. Okay, before we follow Leonardo to the next chapter of his life, we need to talk about a city. Because without this city, Leonardo might have spent his whole life in Vinci, sketching birds in the dirt, and the world would have lost out on one of its greatest treasures. The city is Florence. Florence in the 1460s was one of the most incredible places on the entire planet. It was a city of about 40 to 60,000 people, a huge metropolis by medieval standards, built along the banks of the Arno River in Tuscany. And Florence was at the center of something world-changing called the Renaissance. Now, Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth, but what was being reborn? Ideas, art, science, philosophy, human potential. See, for much of the Middle Ages, the centuries before the Renaissance, European culture had been heavily shaped by strict religious rules about what you could paint, what you could say, what you could study. The human body was considered almost sacred and untouchable. Art was meant to show religious scenes, not real human emotions. But starting in Italy, in cities like Florence, something began to shift. Thinkers and artists started looking back at the ancient Greeks and Romans, brilliant civilizations from over 1,000 years earlier, and they started asking, what if we could be that brilliant again? What if we studied the world the way the Greeks did? What if art could show real people, real feelings, real nature? This was the Renaissance, a rebirth of curiosity, a rebirth of beauty, a rebirth of the idea that human beings could understand and improve the world around them. And Florence was its beating heart. The most powerful family in Florence at this time was the Medici family, specifically Lorenzo de' Medici, who would later be called Lorenzo the Magnificent. The Medicis were bankers who had become so rich and powerful that they essentially ran Florence without officially being kings. And they used their wealth to fund artists, writers, musicians, architects, and philosophers. They believed that beauty and knowledge made civilization greater. Florence was full of workshops, botteghe in Italian, where master craftsmen trained young apprentices. There were workshops for goldsmiths, sculptors, painters, architects, and all kinds of artists and craftspeople. When Leonardo was around 12 or 13 years old, sometime around 1464 or 1466, his father Piero made a decision that would change history. He brought Leonardo to Florence and arranged for him to enter the workshop of one of the most celebrated artists in the city. His name was Andrea del Verrocchio. Fun fact, Verrocchio wasn't actually Andrea's last name. It was a nickname that meant true eye. It was given to him because of his legendary ability to see proportion and detail perfectly. Pretty cool nickname for an artist. Verrocchio's workshop was a big deal. It wasn't just a painting studio. It was a full-service artistic production center. Verrocchio and his apprentices made paintings, sculptures, metalwork, jewelry, stage designs, costumes for festivals, and architectural decorations. If Florence needed something beautiful made, Verrocchio's workshop was one of the places you called. And now into this extraordinary place walked a shy, curious, illegitimate kid from a small country town. Leonardo was probably around 14 or 15 when he began his official apprenticeship with Verrocchio. He would have started at the very bottom, sweeping floors, grinding pigments, that means crushing colored rocks and minerals into fine powder to make paint, preparing wooden panels for paintings, running errands. But even at the bottom, Leonardo would have been surrounded by marvels, by the smell of fresh paint and hot metal, by the sound of hammers on bronze and brushes on plaster, by the sight of great works taking shape before his eyes. He had arrived in the place he was born for. But what happened next inside that workshop? Something so remarkable that Verrocchio himself is said to have put down his paintbrush and never painted again. Stay with us. Chapter 3. The Apprentice Who Outshone His Master. Being an apprentice in a Renaissance workshop wasn't like being a student in school today. You didn't just study from books. You worked. You learned by doing, by watching, by making mistakes, by doing things over and over until they were right. You might spend weeks doing nothing but grinding paint or copying a single drawing hundreds of times. The master, in Leonardo's case Verrocchio, would teach you the technical skills, how to mix colors, how to build up layers of paint, how to measure proportions, how to carve stone, how to cast bronze. But the real teaching happened through observation, through watching a master at work and learning to see the way they saw. Leonardo absorbed everything. Other apprentices might learn what they needed and stop there. Leonardo kept going. He studied anatomy, how bones and muscles actually work, because he believed you couldn't paint a convincing human figure if you didn't understand the machinery underneath the skin. He studied optics, the science of light and vision, because he believed you couldn't paint convincing shadows and highlights unless you understood exactly how light behaves. He was relentless, obsessive. The other apprentices probably thought he was a little strange. One of the most legendary stories from this period, and historians believe it has real truth to it, involves a painting called The Baptism of Christ. Verrocchio was working on this painting, which showed the moment when Jesus was baptized in the river Jordan by John the Baptist. It was a fairly standard religious subject for the time. As was common in workshops, the master would do the main figures and the most important parts, and the apprentices would help fill in sections, backgrounds, less important figures, that kind of thing. Verrocchio assigned young Leonardo to paint one of the angels in the lower left corner of the painting. Now, you can still see this painting today. It lives in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and when you look at it, something immediately stands out. The angel that Leonardo painted, kneeling in the lower left, looking toward the center of the scene, is simply more alive than the rest of the painting. Leonardo's angel has soft, glowing skin that seems to breathe. His hair falls in loose, perfectly observed curls. His expression is tender and deeply thoughtful. He looks like a real being, not a painted symbol. The rest of the painting, including the figures painted by Verrocchio himself, looks flatter, more conventional, more like the art of its time. Leonardo's angel looks like it stepped out of a different century. The story goes, and the writer Giorgio Vasari, who wrote a famous book about Italian artists in the 16th century, recorded this, that when Verrocchio saw what Leonardo had painted, he was so stunned, so humbled, that he swore he would never paint again, because his young apprentice had surpassed him completely. Whether Verrocchio literally said those exact words, we can't be totally sure. But here's the fascinating thing. He really did stop painting after this. He focused on sculpture and other work, and never picked up a paintbrush again for his major projects. The student had outgrown the teacher. Fun fact, Verrocchio wasn't insulted by Leonardo's talent. He was proud of it. He continued to work closely with Leonardo for years, and it's believed that Leonardo helped design and engineer some of Verrocchio's greatest sculptures, including the famous bronze equestrian statue of a warlord called Bartolomeo Colleoni, which still stands in Venice today. By his early 20s, Leonardo was no longer just an apprentice. He was becoming one of the most talked-about young artists in Florence. In 1472, at around age 20, Leonardo was officially accepted into the Guild of St. Luke, the professional guild for painters in Florence. This meant he was now a fully qualified master painter in his own right. He could take on his own commissions. He could run his own workshop. He was a professional artist. But here's the thing about Leonardo. Professional artist was never going to be enough for him, because even as his paintings dazzled Florence, his mind was already racing miles ahead, into territory that no artist had ever dared to explore. What was he planning, and why would it eventually lead him to leave the city of Florence entirely? Chapter 4. Questions, Paintings, and a Mysterious Unfinished Canvas. By his mid-20s, Leonardo was living in Florence and working as an independent master artist, although he still spent a great deal of time in Verrocchio's orbit. And here we begin to see a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Leonardo's entire life. He was brilliant at starting things. He was terrible at finishing them. This sounds like a joke, but it was actually a serious problem and a serious mystery. Why would someone of Leonardo's extraordinary talent and work ethic leave so many projects unfinished? Here's one answer. Leonardo wasn't just painting pictures. He was solving problems. Every painting was a scientific experiment. Every portrait was an anatomy study. Every landscape was a geology and light investigation. And sometimes, many times, by the time he'd solved all the intellectual puzzles that a painting posed for him, he'd lost interest in the purely mechanical act of finishing it. It drove his clients absolutely crazy. One famous example, in 1481, the monks of a monastery called San Donato a Scopeto commissioned Leonardo to paint a large altarpiece, a painting meant to go above the altar in their church. The subject was the adoration of the Magi, which means the scene where the three wise men come to visit the baby Jesus. Leonardo began working on it. He made detailed preparatory drawings, studies for the poses of the figures, studies of horses, studies of the architectural ruins in the background. The surviving preparatory drawing, which you can still see today, is absolutely extraordinary. Dozens of figures swirling around a central scene, full of emotion and movement. And then he stopped. He never finished the painting. The monks eventually hired someone else to do a completely different painting instead. What was Leonardo doing instead? Well, notebooks suggest he was simultaneously thinking about hydraulics, the science of water and water systems, and geometry, and horses, and the structure of buildings, and the flight of birds. His mind simply couldn't stay still long enough to apply paint in a straight line for months on end. Fun fact, art historians have counted that Leonardo finished only around 15 to 20 paintings in his entire career, an incredibly small number for an artist of his era, when painters were expected to produce work constantly. Many of the paintings he started were left unfinished or were completed by his assistants. Despite this, the paintings he did finish are among the most famous and most studied artworks in human history. During his Florence years, Leonardo also found himself in a slightly awkward social position. Remember, he was an illegitimate child. In Florence's status-conscious society, this mattered. Even though he was enormously talented, he couldn't inherit property the way legitimate sons could, couldn't enter certain professions, and faced subtle but real social limitations. He had a small circle of friends and fellow artists. He was reportedly charming, good-looking, physically strong. Historical accounts say he was tall, with long curling hair, and that he was so strong he could reportedly bend a horseshoe with his bare hands. But there was also something private, almost secretive about him. He kept his thoughts in those backwards written notebooks, encrypted almost by their mirror writing. He had strong feelings he rarely shared publicly. Leonardo was also a vegetarian, which, in 15th century Italy, was so unusual as to be almost bizarre. He reportedly had deep compassion for animals, sometimes buying caged birds in the marketplace just to open the cage and let them go free. He was in every way different from almost everyone around him, and by around 1482, when Leonardo was 30 years old, he made a decision that would launch the most productive and extraordinary phase of his life. He left Florence. He was heading north to a city of power, wealth, and ambition, and to a man who was one of the most powerful rulers in Italy. What was Leonardo going to offer this powerful ruler, and what was the one skill he mentioned barely at all? The answer will surprise you. Chapter 5. Welcome to Milan. Leonardo meets his Duke. The city of Milan, in the 1480s, was a powerhouse. Milan sat in the north of Italy, in a flat, fertile region called Lombardy. It was a city of trade, of manufacturing, of military power. It was ruled by a man named Ludovico Sforza, a calculating, ambitious, brilliantly political man who had essentially stolen the dukedom from his own young nephew and installed himself as the ruler. Ludovico loved art, music, spectacle, and engineering. He wanted to make Milan the most magnificent city in Italy. He wanted his court to dazzle everyone who visited. And Leonardo da Vinci, sitting in Florence and growing restless, apparently wrote him a letter. Now this letter, or something very like it, survived, and it is one of the most remarkable documents in art history. Because here's what Leonardo didn't say in that letter. I am the greatest painter in Italy. Please hire me to make beautiful things. Instead, Leonardo spent almost the entire letter describing himself as a military engineer. He told Ludovico he could design portable bridges that armies could use to cross rivers quickly. He could design cannons of a new, devastating kind. He could build armored vehicles. He could create siege machines, devices for attacking castle walls. He could dig tunnels under enemy fortifications. He could design warships. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost like he was embarrassed to mention it, right at the very end of the letter, Leonardo added, "Also, I can do sculpture, and I can paint, as well as anyone." He basically listed painting like a footnote. Why would the greatest painter of his age downplay his own painting? Probably because Leonardo understood his audience. Ludovico Sforza didn't primarily need beauty. He needed power. He needed military strength. He needed engineers who could help him build and defend his territory. Leonardo was telling this powerful man, I can give you everything you need. It worked. Sometime around 1482, Leonardo arrived in Milan. He would stay for nearly 18 years. Fun fact. Historians aren't completely sure whether Leonardo actually sent the famous letter directly, or whether it was a draft that summarized what he communicated through intermediaries. But either way, he did arrive in Milan around this time, and Ludovico Sforza became his primary patron, his employer and protector, for almost 2 decades. A patron was kind of like a sponsor or a boss, providing housing, payment, and materials in exchange for an artist's work and skill. Life at Ludovico's court was unlike anything Leonardo had experienced in Florence. The court was lavish, spectacular, theatrical. There were banquets and tournaments and elaborate entertainments. There were musicians and poets and scholars from across Italy and beyond. There were constant political intrigues and alliances being made and broken. And in the middle of all of it was Leonardo, painting, sculpting, designing, inventing, teaching, and filling notebook after notebook after notebook. He designed elaborate costumes and stage sets for court entertainments, productions so spectacular they left audiences speechless. He helped design buildings and urban improvements for the city. He worked on hydraulic systems, ways to control and channel Milan's rivers and canals. And he kept painting. Despite the military engineering pitch in his letter, Leonardo was still an artist first. Some of his greatest works came from this Milan period. One of them is a painting that lives today in a convent in Milan, on a wall, an actual wall, where it has been for over 500 years. And that painting is one of the most famous images in the history of human civilization. We're talking about the Last Supper, and the story of how it was made is almost as astonishing as the painting itself. Chapter 6, The Last Supper, the painting that changed everything. Take a breath, because we're about to talk about a painting that for 5 centuries has made people stand in front of it and simply forget to speak. In 1495, Ludovico Sforza commissioned Leonardo to paint a mural, a painting directly on a wall in the dining hall of a convent called Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. The subject was the Last Supper, the final meal that Jesus shared with his 12 apostles, his closest followers, the night before he was crucified. It's a story from the Bible that had been painted hundreds of times before. Every artist in Italy knew how to paint the Last Supper. Leonardo was going to paint it completely differently. Most artists painted the Last Supper as a calm, symbolic scene, Jesus and the apostles sitting peacefully, almost like a formal portrait. The figures were arranged neatly, their expressions serene. Leonardo asked himself a different question. What is the single most dramatic, most emotionally charged moment in this story? And he decided, it's the moment right after Jesus says to his apostles, "One of you will betray me." Think about what that moment must have felt like. 12 people around a table, someone in this room, someone who has been a friend, a follower, a companion, is going to hand Jesus over to his enemies. Who is it? Who knows? Who is afraid? Who is angry? Who is in denial? That's what Leonardo painted. And because he was Leonardo, he couldn't just sketch it out and start painting. He studied and planned and thought for years. He made hundreds of sketches, of hands, of faces, of expressions. He reportedly wandered the streets of Milan, searching for faces that expressed exactly the right emotions. This man's face for shock, that woman's face for grief, this criminal's face for guilt. There's a story, possibly true, possibly legendary, but completely fitting, that the prior of the convent, the man in charge of the monastery, grew furious at how slowly Leonardo was working. He complained to Ludovico Sforza that Leonardo would sometimes come to the painting, stare at it for an hour, make 1 or 2 brush strokes, and then leave. When Ludovico passed this complaint on to Leonardo, Leonardo apparently responded with cool logic. He explained that great creators sometimes go long periods without working, and yet their minds are at work the whole time. And then he added diplomatically that the only figure in the painting he hadn't yet completed was Judas, the apostle who would betray Jesus, and that if the prior kept bothering him, he might just use the prior's face as the model for Judas. Ludovico apparently found this hilarious. The prior presumably did not. The painting took approximately 3 years to complete, finishing around 1498. And when it was done, the world couldn't look away. The genius of the Last Supper is that Leonardo solved every artistic problem with breathtaking cleverness. He organized the 12 apostles into 4 groups of 3, each group reacting differently to Jesus' devastating announcement. On your left, some apostles lean away in shock and horror. On your right, others lean in with questions and protests. And at the center, perfectly still, perfectly calm in contrast to the chaos all around him, sits Jesus, his hands open on the table, his eyes cast slightly downward. Leonardo used something called perspective, a mathematical technique for creating the illusion of depth on a flat surface, so perfectly that the painted room appears to extend the actual room. It looks like you could walk right into the painting. And the faces are extraordinary. Every apostle is an individual, a real person with a distinct personality and a unique reaction. Did you know? The expression "in the arms of Morpheus" refers to the god of sleep. But here's a real "did you know" for the Last Supper. For about 300 years, the painting was badly damaged and nearly lost. Leonardo, experimentally, painted it not in the traditional fresco technique, where you paint onto wet plaster that bonds permanently, but in an experimental dry technique that let him work more slowly and make changes. Unfortunately, this technique didn't hold up well. By 1517, while Leonardo was still alive, people were already noting damage. By the 1700s, it was described as a wreck. It was nearly lost in 1943 when World War II bombs destroyed the building around it. But the wall with the painting survived because workers had packed it with sandbags, a massive restoration project that lasted from 1978 to 1999 painstakingly brought back as much of the original painting as possible. Today, you can visit the Last Supper in Milan. You have to book your visit months in advance. Visitors are only allowed in for 15 minutes at a time, in small groups, to protect the painting from humidity and breath. 15 minutes to see something that took years to create, centuries to survive, and will last as long as civilization endures. Not bad for a man who was supposedly being hired to build cannons. But even as Leonardo was astonishing the world with his paintbrush, his notebooks were filling up with ideas that were so far ahead of their time, it took 500 years for the world to catch up. What was he inventing? Stick around. Chapter 7. The Notebook Genius, Inventions and Investigations. Okay, let's talk about the notebooks. Because this, honestly, might be the most mind-bending part of Leonardo's whole story. Throughout his life, Leonardo carried notebooks everywhere. Small ones he tucked in his belt. Larger ones he kept on his desk. He filled them constantly, while he was eating, while he was walking, in the middle of the night. He wrote and drew in that peculiar mirror script of his, from right to left, so that you needed an actual mirror to read most of it. Why did he write backwards? Historians have a few theories. He was left-handed. Writing from right to left would have prevented his hand from smearing the still wet ink as he wrote. Some think it was a habit. Some think it was a light form of privacy protection. Leonardo himself never explained it, as far as we know. What was in these notebooks? Everything. Over 5,000 pages survive today, spread across libraries and museums in England, Italy, France, and Spain. They are called codices. That's the plural of codex, a Latin word for a book. And if you open them, here's what you find. Inventions: the flying machines. Leonardo was absolutely obsessed with flight, consumed by it. He spent decades studying birds, watching how they moved their wings, how they used air currents, how they landed. He made detailed anatomical drawings of bird wings. And then he designed machines to replicate them. He drew a design for an ornithopter, a machine with flapping wings, powered by a human operator using their arms and legs. The design is remarkably thoughtful, accounting for the mechanics of how human body weight and muscle strength could generate lift. He drew designs for a helicopter. Not exactly like our helicopters, but a device with a spiral-shaped rotor that he believed would screw itself upward into the air, like a corkscrew drilling into a surface. He called it the aerial screw. He drew a hang glider, essentially the same concept used in modern hang gliders, with a rigid wing frame that a person could cling to and glide. Did any of these machines actually fly? As far as we know, no, at least not in Leonardo's lifetime. They were theoretical designs. But here's the jaw-dropping part. Many of Leonardo's flying machine concepts were based on sound aerodynamic principles. When modern engineers have built working models based on his designs, some of them actually work. Fun fact, Leonardo also designed, wait for it, a parachute, a pyramid-shaped canopy made of linen that he calculated could allow a person to jump from any height without injury. In 2000, a British skydiver named Adrian Nicholas actually built a parachute based on Leonardo's exact 500-year-old specifications and jumped from a hot air balloon at 10,000 feet. It worked. Leonardo da Vinci designed a functional parachute in the 1480s. Inventions: war machines and engineering. Remember how Leonardo pitched himself as a military engineer? Well, he meant it. His notebooks are full of war machines that are frankly terrifying to contemplate. He designed an armored vehicle, a circular, shell-shaped contraption with cannons pointing out in all directions, operated by men inside. It's basically a Renaissance-era tank. Historians who've analyzed the design note that Leonardo may have intentionally included a flaw in the gear system. The gears would have turned the wheels in opposite directions, making it impossible to move. Some believe this was deliberate, a subtle act of sabotage from a man who, despite designing weapons, deeply hated war. He designed a multi-barreled cannon, something like an early machine gun, that could fire many shots quickly by rotating barrels. He designed a giant crossbow on wheels so enormous that it would have required dozens of men to operate. But Leonardo also designed things meant to build up, not tear down. He designed an elaborate canal and water management system for the region around Milan. He proposed plans for rebuilding parts of the city after a devastating plague, plans that included wider streets, better sewage systems, and a separation of pedestrian and cart traffic. His urban planning ideas were centuries ahead of their time. He designed a water wheel, a printing machine, a loom for weaving cloth automatically, and dozens of other labor-saving mechanical devices. The human body. Here is where Leonardo did something that was genuinely shocking for his time. He dissected human bodies, not just one or two. Over the course of his career, Leonardo is believed to have dissected somewhere between 30 and 100 human corpses, an extraordinary number. This was legal, under certain conditions, in Renaissance Italy. Medical schools and hospitals sometimes allowed scholars access to bodies for study, but it was still deeply uncomfortable work, physically and socially. The smell alone was overwhelming. Leonardo worked quickly in cold conditions to slow decomposition, and he worked alone, usually at night. And what he found inside the human body, he recorded in drawings, so accurate, so detailed, so beautifully observed, that medical textbooks wouldn't catch up with them for over a century. He drew the heart and correctly described the two pumping chambers. He drew the flow of blood through arteries and veins. He drew the structure of bones, the attachment points of muscles, the way tendons connect and move. He drew a human fetus in the womb, curled, small, perfectly observed, and got the position essentially correct. He drew the skull and the brain with remarkable accuracy. Did you know? Leonardo also studied geology, the science of rocks and earth, and correctly concluded, 500 years before it was widely accepted, that the fossils found in the mountains of Italy were once living sea creatures. He figured out that the mountains had once been covered by the sea, and that the earth must be enormously old, far older than most people of his time believed. Water, light, and mathematics. Leonardo was fascinated by water to the point of obsession. He spent years studying how water flows, how waves form, how rivers carve valleys, how floods happen. He filled pages with intricate drawings of water in motion, swirling, crashing, falling. He was equally fascinated by light. He studied how shadows work, how light scatters, why the sky is blue, why objects in the distance look hazy and blue-tinted, a phenomenon he called sfumato in painting, and which he applied to create the breathtaking atmospheric distances in his paintings. He worked out principles of mathematics and geometry that mathematicians of his day would have recognized as sophisticated. And he did all of this without going to university, without formal scientific training, without peers to discuss his work with, without scientific institutions to publish in. He did it alone, at a desk, by candlelight, writing backwards in notebooks that wouldn't be fully studied until centuries after his death. Fun fact, Leonardo's notebooks were not published during his lifetime. After he died, they passed through various hands, got separated, lost, rediscovered. Some were cut up and sold page by page. Some were damaged by water or fire. If all of his notebooks had been published right after his death, if scientists and engineers in the 1520s had sat down and studied them, the history of technology might have advanced by decades or even a century. The steam engine, the helicopter, modern anatomy, all of it might have come much, much sooner. But in a way, there's something poetic about it. Leonardo kept these ideas in his private world of notebooks, this vast, extraordinary private universe of thought, and the world had to rediscover them slowly, one by one, across the centuries. But we can't spend any more time in the notebooks, because back in Milan, trouble was brewing, and it was about to change Leonardo's life completely. Chapter 8, Upheaval, War, Loss, and the Road Without Maps. For nearly 18 years, Leonardo's life in Milan had been extraordinary. He had painted The Last Supper. He had filled notebooks with the ideas of a dozen lifetimes. He had helped design improvements to the city, created spectacular entertainments for the court, taught a group of talented students who gathered around him like disciples. He had also been working on what was supposed to be his greatest sculpture, a massive bronze statue of a horse, the Gran Cavallo, the Great Horse, commissioned by Ludovico Sforza to honor the Sforza family. Leonardo made a model of the horse in clay. It stood 24 feet tall, 2 stories high. People who saw it were stunned. It was declared a marvel. All that remained was the pouring of the bronze. And then war came. In 1494, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, triggering a series of wars that would tear the Italian peninsula apart for decades. Milan was directly threatened. Ludovico Sforza made a terrible decision. Instead of casting Leonardo's magnificent horse statue in bronze, he sent all the bronze that had been set aside for it to his brother-in-law to be cast into cannons. The clay model of the horse was left where it stood. And then, a few years later, when French soldiers captured Milan in 1499, they used Leonardo's clay horse for target practice. Archers shot it to pieces. 24 years of Leonardo's work on that sculpture, studying horses, designing the casting process, crafting the model, destroyed by soldiers who wanted something to aim at. It was one of the great losses in art history. Leonardo himself had to flee Milan when the French arrived. Ludovico Sforza's regime collapsed, and Leonardo, who had served the Duke for 18 years, suddenly had no patron, no home base, no safety net. He was 47 years old, and he was essentially starting over. What followed was a somewhat unsettled period in Leonardo's life. He traveled, took on different patrons, moved from city to city. He worked briefly for a terrifying man named Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, a powerful and ruthless military commander who was conquering territories across central Italy. Leonardo served as Borgia's military engineer, traveling with his army and making maps and surveys of the territories. His maps from this period are extraordinary. He made a map of the town of Imola, a bird's-eye view of the town's streets and buildings that is so accurate it looks like it could have been made from an airplane. In a time before aerial photography, before surveying instruments, Leonardo walked those streets and somehow produced a map of almost geometric perfection. He didn't stay with Borgia long. The man was dangerous to be around. Leonardo also returned to Florence for a period, the city of his youth, where he found a city that had changed dramatically in his 18-year absence. The Medici family had been briefly expelled. The religious reformer Girolamo Savonarola had taken over and ordered citizens to burn their luxuries, paintings, books, mirrors, fine clothes, in enormous bonfires called the Bonfire of the Vanities. Savonarola himself had eventually been executed. Florence was still finding its footing. But Leonardo was still Leonardo, and Florence still needed great art. In 1503, the city council commissioned Leonardo to paint a massive mural in the great council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, the main government building. The subject was the Battle of Anghiari, a famous Florentine military victory. Leonardo began work on it. And, you guessed it, he never finished it. An experimental wall preparation technique failed, the colors ran, and Leonardo eventually abandoned the project. But here's something remarkable that came out of this period. While he was in Florence, sometime around 1503, though the dating is uncertain, Leonardo began work on a small portrait of a woman. It was about 30 inches tall, 21 inches wide. He would carry it with him for the rest of his life. Did you know? The Mona Lisa is actually a relatively small painting. If you've never seen it in person and you're imagining a huge canvas, prepare to be surprised. The original painting is about the size of a large kitchen cutting board, yet it is guarded by bulletproof glass, displayed in its own special room, and visited by millions of people every single year. It is arguably the most famous painting in human history. But who was the woman in that portrait, and what makes her smile so utterly unforgettable? The mystery is deeper than you think. Chapter 9, the most famous smile in the world, the Mona Lisa. Let's talk about the painting. La Gioconda, or as most of the world calls it, the Mona Lisa. Even if you've never been to a museum in your life, You've probably seen this image. It's on posters, on t-shirts, on coffee mugs, in cartoons, in movies, in memes. It is everywhere. But look at the actual painting for a moment. Really look at it. A woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, sits in a three-quarter pose, turned slightly to face us, but not completely. Her hands are folded in her lap. Her dark hair falls softly to her shoulders, partially covered by a thin dark veil. She wears a dark dress, with a green sleeve visible beneath. And she smiles. But what a smile it is! It's not a full smile. It's not teeth showing, wide-open happiness. It's something much more subtle, much more complicated. The corners of her mouth turn up just slightly. Her eyes have a particular quality, watching, thinking, amused, perhaps a little distant. She seems to know something you don't. Scientists, art historians, and psychologists have actually studied this smile extensively. One fascinating explanation: Leonardo used a technique where the smile appears different depending on which part of the painting you focus on. When you look at her eyes, peripheral vision makes her mouth appear to be smiling more broadly, but when you look directly at her mouth, the smile seems to fade slightly. This creates the eerie, shifting quality. Her expression seems to change as you look at it. Now, who was she? The most widely accepted identification, supported by a note discovered in 2005 in a Florentine archive, is that she was a real woman named Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. That's why the painting is also called La Gioconda, the Italian feminine form of her husband's name. Francesco del Giocondo commissioned the portrait, probably to celebrate the birth of their second son and their new home, sometime around 1503. But here's the mystery. Francesco never received his painting. Leonardo kept it. He carried it with him when he left Florence. He carried it to Milan when he returned there for a time. He carried it to Rome. And finally, he carried it all the way to France. Why did he never deliver it? Was he never satisfied with it? Was he still working on it? Did he simply not want to part with it? Nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that Leonardo reportedly worked on the Mona Lisa for about 4 years, an extraordinary amount of time for a portrait, and that he considered it dear enough to keep close until his death. Fun fact: the Mona Lisa has a landscape in the background, misty, dreamlike valleys and winding roads. Scientists who have studied the painting have argued about whether this landscape represents a real place in Tuscany or is entirely imaginary. Interestingly, the landscape behind the left shoulder of the figure is slightly higher than the landscape behind the right shoulder, as if they're painted from slightly different viewpoints. This subtle asymmetry may contribute to the painting's strange, dreamlike quality. The technique Leonardo used throughout this painting is called sfumato, a word that means smoked or misty in Italian. Instead of painting sharp, clear outlines, Leonardo blended colors and tones so gradually, so softly, that edges seem to dissolve into shadow. There are no hard lines. Skin flows into shadow, flows into background in an almost imperceptible gradation. This technique was revolutionary. No one had painted quite like this before. Leonardo achieved it with extraordinary skill, building up dozens of thin layers of translucent paint, each layer barely visible on its own, but together creating a depth and softness that looks almost photographic. In 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre Museum in Paris, cut from its frame and smuggled out under a thief's coat. The theft caused a global sensation. The painting was missing for more than 2 years. When it was finally recovered, found in a Florence hotel room, the recovery made front-page news around the world. The theft, ironically, made the Mona Lisa more famous than it had ever been before. The whole world now knew this painting's name. And Leonardo, who had painted it over 400 years before the theft, who had carried it across half of Europe, who had never let it go, would have been astounded and perhaps amused to see what his little portrait had become. But while Leonardo was painting and pondering and carrying his painting from city to city, time was passing. He was getting older, and the final chapter of his life was about to begin. Chapter 10: Rome, Rivalry, and the Road to France. Around 1513, when Leonardo was 61 years old, he moved to Rome. By this point, the art world of Italy had shifted dramatically. When Leonardo was young, he was the brightest star. But now a new generation had emerged, and two of its members were dazzlingly, incomparably talented. Their names were Michelangelo and Raphael. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Leonardo's junior by 23 years, was a sculptor and painter of volcanic, almost terrifying power. He had already finished painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, a work so vast and so magnificent it remains one of the greatest artistic achievements in human history. Raphael Sanzio, younger still at 30 years old in 1513, was painting breathtaking frescoes in the Pope's private apartments in the Vatican with a grace and beauty that left viewers speechless. Rome in the years of Pope Leo V, the son of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, was the new center of the artistic world, and Leonardo came to it. But Leonardo's time in Rome was not a triumphant chapter. He had a workshop provided by the Pope in the Vatican. He was treated with respect, but he wasn't given major painting commissions. He was in his 60s, old by the standards of the time, and the Pope, apparently impatient with Leonardo's legendary slowness, reportedly favored the younger, faster artists. Leonardo spent much of his Roman years doing what he always did, experimenting, studying, filling notebooks. He worked on geometry. He worked on geological and hydrological studies, water, rivers, floods. He experimented with new techniques for painting and varnishing. He also, reportedly, spent time preparing a human body for dissection at a hospital, only to have the Pope put a stop to it, apparently because someone complained that it was inappropriate. Leonardo felt sidelined, underused. Rome was the center of everything, and yet he felt like a man watching through a window. There's a painful glimpse of this in one of his notebook entries from around this period. He wrote, with a sadness that reaches across 5 centuries, something that translates roughly as, "I shall never be done." He was 60 years old. He had accomplished more than 100 men in 100 lifetimes, and he still felt like he hadn't finished. And then came an offer that would change everything. A young king, Francis I of France, who had come to the French throne in 1515 at the age of 20, was completely besotted with Italian Renaissance art. He had invaded northern Italy, as French kings kept doing, and in his campaigns he had seen the Last Supper in Milan. He had been overwhelmed by it. Francis I wanted Leonardo da Vinci. Not just his paintings, not just his designs. He wanted the man himself. He wanted to talk with him, learn from him, simply be in the presence of the greatest mind in Europe. He invited Leonardo to France. He offered him a position of extraordinary honor, first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. He offered Leonardo a beautiful manor house, the Château du Clos-Lucé, in the Loire Valley, near the royal castle of Amboise. He offered him a pension, a regular income, so that Leonardo would never need to worry about money again. He offered him freedom, no more patrons who wanted things done quickly, no more pressure to produce, no more feeling sidelined. Francis I essentially offered Leonardo a peaceful place to be himself for whatever years he had left. In 1516, at the age of 64, an old man by the standards of an era when many people didn't live past 50, Leonardo da Vinci packed his most precious belongings, gathered his most devoted students, and made the journey over the Alps into France. He brought 3 paintings with him: the Mona Lisa, a painting of St. John the Baptist, and a painting known today as the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. 3 masterpieces, folded in cloth, loaded onto mule carts, carried over mountain passes. He would never return to Italy. And in France, in a quiet manor by a river, the greatest mind of the Renaissance would spend his final years. What happened there? And when the candle finally went out, what was left behind? Chapter 11, Clos-Luce, the last years of Leonardo da Vinci. The Château du Clos-Lucé is a lovely place. It sits in a small town called Amboise in the Loire Valley of France, a green, gentle region of rivers and chateaux, where the French nobility built their country estates. The manor house is built of pink and white stone, surrounded by gardens and trees. A tunnel, still visible today, connected it to the nearby royal Château d'Amboise, so that King Francis I could walk over and visit Leonardo without even going outside. The king came often. By all accounts, Francis I genuinely loved Leonardo. Not just his art or his engineering, he loved talking with him. He would sit with the old man for hours, listening to him speak about whatever was on his mind: science, philosophy, art, mathematics, the nature of the world. Francis I reportedly said, and this is documented by one of Leonardo's contemporaries, that he believed no other man had been born with as much knowledge as Leonardo, and that he considered himself fortunate beyond measure to be able to speak with him. For the first time in his life, Leonardo was not being asked to deliver commissions on impossible deadlines. He was not performing for a patron's political needs. He was not being pressured to produce. He was simply living, thinking, working at his own pace. He continued filling notebooks. He worked on his anatomical drawings, refining and completing studies that had taken decades. He worked on mathematics. He worked on studies of water. He also reportedly continued to work on the Mona Lisa, making tiny adjustments, tiny improvements, still not quite satisfied after more than a decade. His hands had begun to trouble him. At some point during his time in France, possibly earlier during his Roman period, Leonardo suffered what seems to have been a stroke or some neurological event that affected his right hand. Since Leonardo was left-handed, this didn't prevent him from painting or drawing, but it did limit some of his physical abilities. He was surrounded by his students and assistants, chief among them a young man named Francesco Melzi, who had been with Leonardo since his Milan years and who was utterly devoted to his master. Melzi would care for Leonardo in these final years with the tenderness of a son. And there was also in these years the work of organizing, of sorting, of looking back. Can you imagine it? Looking back across a life like Leonardo's? The paintings that changed art forever, the notebooks that contained 500 years of secrets, the flying machines and the anatomy studies and the canal designs and the war machines, the faces of the people he had known, Verrocchio, Ludovico Sforza, Cesare Borgia, Francis I, the city of Florence glittering in his memory, the wall in Milan where his Last Supper still stood. He had seen more, done more, thought more than almost any human being who had ever lived. And on the 2nd of May, in the year 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died. He was 67 years old. The circumstances of his death are recorded, with some legendary embellishment that's hard to separate from fact, by the biographer Giorgio Vasari, who wrote that Leonardo died in the arms of King Francis I himself, who had come to be with his beloved guest at the end. Whether this is literally true is debated by historians. Records show Francis I may have been elsewhere that day. But it is a beautiful image, a great king, young and vital, holding the hand of the greatest mind of the age in a quiet manor house by a French river as the spring birds sang outside. Leonardo was buried in the chapel of Saint Florentin at the Château d'Amboise. Years later, during the French Revolution, that chapel was destroyed and his grave was lost. Some remains believed to be his were later reinterred in the chapel of Saint Hubert at Amboise, where a plaque marks what may be his final resting place. His notebooks and belongings passed to Francesco Melzi, who guarded them carefully for the rest of his long life. When Melzi died in around 1570, the notebooks were scattered, sold, given away, lost, rediscovered, beginning a journey through history that is still being completed today. The Mona Lisa eventually became the property of the French crown, and after many centuries it ended up where it lives today, in the Louvre Museum in Paris, behind bulletproof glass, in a climate-controlled room, with its own dedicated security team. Leonardo had carried it across the Alps in a mule cart. Now it has bodyguards. Something about that feels exactly right. But we can't end here, because the real story, the most important story, isn't about how Leonardo died. It's about what he left behind and what we're still discovering. Chapter 12, The Legacy, What Leonardo Left the World. 500 years. That's how long ago Leonardo da Vinci walked the earth. 500 years ago, there were no smartphones, no airplanes, no cars, no electricity, no running water in most homes, no anesthesia for surgery. People didn't know what germs were. Most people couldn't read. And yet in a stone manor house in France, an old man was writing, backwards, in candlelight, thoughts that would not be fully understood for generations. Let that sink in for a moment. Leonardo left the world his notebooks. Over 5,000 surviving pages of drawings, diagrams, observations, calculations, and wonderings. They are preserved today in libraries and museums across Europe. The Codex Atlanticus in Milan, the Windsor Collection in England, the Codex Arundel in London, the Codex Leicester in the collection of Bill Gates, who purchased it in 1994 for $30 million and has made it available for public display. $30 million for a notebook written 500 years ago by one man. The notebooks contain multitudes. They contain the earliest known design for an aerial screw, what we would recognize as a helicopter. It took humanity until 1939 to actually fly one. They contain anatomical drawings so accurate that they were used as references in medical education for centuries and are still marveled at by doctors today. They contain a design for a solar power concentrator, using mirrors to concentrate the sun's energy for heating and power. We are still developing solar power today in the 21st century. They contain designs for a calculator, a mechanical device for calculating numerical sums. They contain a design for a robot, an armored, humanoid mechanical knight that could move its arms and legs through a system of ropes and pulleys. In 2002, a roboticist named Mark Roshim built a working model based on Leonardo's sketches. They contain designs for an early automobile, a self-propelled cart driven by a system of springs, and a bicycle-like vehicle that predates the actual invention of the bicycle by over 200 years. They contain studies of light and optics that align with discoveries made by physicists centuries later. They contain the first recorded description of tectonic geology, the idea that the Earth's surface moves and changes over vast timescales. They contain, in short, glimpses of a mind that was running at a frequency the rest of the world could barely detect. Fun fact, in 2019, scientists used a technique called X-ray fluorescence to examine some of Leonardo's drawings in extraordinary detail, analyzing the exact mixtures of pigments and minerals he used. They discovered details about his working methods that had been hidden for 5 centuries. New scientific tools keep unlocking new secrets from his work, more than 500 years after he made it. And then there are the paintings. Only around 15 to 20 paintings attributed to Leonardo survive. That's an astonishingly small number, and yet those 15 or 20 works have shaped the entire course of Western art. His technique of sfumato, those soft, smokily blended contours, influenced every painter who came after him, and is still studied in art schools today. His approach to painting human emotion, finding the exact moment of maximum psychological tension, as in The Last Supper, revolutionized narrative painting. His understanding of light and shadow, built on years of scientific study, created a depth and realism in his figures that still astonishes experts. And the paintings themselves, despite their small number, have been the subjects of books, films, scientific analyses, conspiracy theories, pilgrimages, thefts, and restorations. They are arguably the most talked about artworks in human history. But you know what I find most remarkable about Leonardo's legacy? It's not the inventions, it's not even the paintings. It's the curiosity. Leonardo da Vinci was born illegitimate in a small country town, to parents who weren't married. He never went to university. He never had formal scientific training. He was working in an age when many of the most basic tools of modern science, the microscope, the telescope, accurate clocks, the scientific method, hadn't been invented yet. And yet he looked at the world, every stream, every shadow, every bird in flight, every human face, and he said, I want to understand this. I want to know why this works the way it does. I want to write it down. He was never fully satisfied. He always felt he hadn't done enough, hadn't finished enough, hadn't understood enough. That note in his Roman period notebook, I shall never be done, speaks of a man whose hunger for knowledge was simply larger than one lifetime could contain. But here's what I want you to hear, especially if you're the kind of person who asks a lot of questions. The kind of person who wonders why the sky is that particular color at sunset, or how a bird can just fall asleep on a wire without falling off, or what makes a sad song feel different from a happy one. Leonardo da Vinci was that kid. He was the kid who looked at things other people walked right past, and he stopped. He looked. He asked why. And nobody in the 500 years since his death has matched the range and depth of what that curiosity produced. Fun fact, many of the greatest scientists, artists, and engineers of the modern era have cited Leonardo as a hero and an inspiration. Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple, famously kept The Last Supper and Leonardo's notebooks as sources of creative inspiration. The great scientist Albert Einstein reportedly had a picture of Leonardo in his study. Astronaut and scientist Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman to travel in space, has spoken about Leonardo as a model for the kind of multidisciplinary thinking that drives true innovation. Did you know? The term Renaissance man, which we use today to describe someone who is brilliant at many different things at once, was essentially coined because of Leonardo da Vinci. He defines the concept. When we call someone a Renaissance man or Renaissance woman, we are measuring them against Leonardo, whether we know it or not. And yet, for all his brilliance, Leonardo was also profoundly human. He struggled with procrastination. He got distracted. He left things unfinished. He felt lonely at times and misunderstood. He worked for men he probably didn't fully trust or respect because he needed their support. He made mistakes. The Last Supper is flaking off its wall precisely because of an experiment that didn't work. He was brilliant and imperfect, visionary and frustrated, world-changing and sometimes deeply unsure of himself, which is, in some ways, the most human thing about him. We are almost at the end of our journey, but before we go, there's one final thought I want to leave you with, because I think it's the most important thing this whole story has been building toward. Here's something that has always gotten me about Leonardo da Vinci. He never stopped being amazed. At 60 years old, he was still getting up close to rivers to watch how the water moved around rocks, still sketching the muscles in the wing of a dead bird, still staring at the sky and wondering how the light worked, still asking questions he'd been asking for 40 years, still not satisfied with his own answers. He was one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived, and he never, not once, thought he had figured it all out. Because for Leonardo, the joy wasn't in having the answers. The joy was in the asking. He wrote in one of his notebooks, I'm paraphrasing because his Italian is old and complex, something close to this idea, that the natural human desire to know, to investigate, to understand, is one of the highest expressions of what it means to be alive. He believed that being curious, genuinely, actively, passionately curious about the world was not a childish thing to outgrow. It was the most important thing a person could be. And I think about that when I look at the world around us now. We live in a time when you can look up almost any fact in seconds, when you can watch a video about almost anything, how black holes form, how the immune system fights a virus, how a symphony is composed, how the ancient Romans built their roads, when more knowledge is available to more people than at any other point in human history. And I wonder what Leonardo would have done with all of that. I think he would have been completely overwhelmed, and then completely electrified, and then he would have sat down, pulled out a notebook, and started writing. Backwards, probably. Because here's the thing, and this is what I really, truly want you to take away from today's story. Leonardo da Vinci's greatest invention wasn't the helicopter design, or the tank, or the parachute, or the solar concentrator. It was a way of looking at the world, a way that says, nothing is too small to be interesting, nothing is too large to be understood, every question deserves to be asked, every answer leads to 10 more questions, and that's not a problem, that's the adventure. If you are someone who gets distracted by questions, who wants to know how everything works, who can't walk past a puddle without wondering why it reflects the sky the way it does, you might have a little bit of Leonardo in you. And I'm not saying that to be cute or poetic, I'm saying it because it's true. The world needs people who ask questions. The world needs people who look carefully. The world needs people who fill notebooks, or sketchbooks, or voice memos, or whatever you use, with the things they've noticed and wondered about and haven't yet figured out. Leonardo da Vinci was born in a farmhouse near a small Italian hill town in 1452 and died in a manor house by a French river in 1519. He left behind a small number of paintings that still stop people in their tracks. He left behind thousands of pages of notebooks that scientists and engineers and artists are still mining for ideas and inspiration 5 centuries later. He left behind the most powerful reminder that curiosity, sustained and honored and acted upon, is not just a character trait. It is a superpower. Go ask a question today, write it down, look it up, look outside, wonder about something. That's what Leonardo would have done. That's our story for today. Leonardo da Vinci, painter, sculptor, engineer, scientist, anatomist, inventor, and the most curious person who ever lived. If you want to keep learning about the Renaissance and the extraordinary people who shaped it, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new video. And if you enjoyed this one, drop a comment telling me your favorite fact about Leonardo. I read every single one. Until next time, History Explorers, keep asking questions.